The Odin 2 has been one of the most consistent devices in my everyday carry. The Odin 2 is one of the best handhelds, especially for the money right now. If you're looking for a nice high-end handheld, it's hard to compete with the price point of $300 that the Odin 2 provides, allowing you to emulate basically anything, including stuff like high-end PS2 and GameCube emulation, Nintendo Switch emulation even, to the point where that a lot of people see this as like the default option. And I really like the Odin 2. I made a video talking about how it's been one of my most consistent devices I've used for a long time now. And this is sort of like a 6 months later check-in. This Odin 2 is just a phenomenal device. And how has it changed my gaming experience? What has changed with the device since I last talked about it? Well, the Odin 2 in of itself hasn't changed that much, but the stuff surrounding the Odin 2 has changed. Nintendo Switch emulation has become a lot harder, thanks to Nintendo copyright striking and DMCA claiming just huge swaths of the Nintendo Switch emulation community. Just basically all the forks of Yuzu being taken off of GitHub relatively recently, just almost as slowly killing off the Switch emulation scene, which is rather disappointing. And to me though, that doesn't really change my opinion on the Odin 2. The Odin 2 is still really good, and much like how Citra has been killed by Nintendo, I still see it around. I can still just Google Citra on my PC and download the emulator still. Sure, it's got a little bit harder and you gotta dodge some more nefarious links, but it's still out there and you can still download the most recent version of Citra. Even Yuzu, a more prominent example of an emulator that Nintendo killed, is still available. Sure, it's a little bit harder to get your hands on, but in my experience, I still find it everywhere online. And there's still Ryujinx, though Ryujinx being a much worse emulator in my opinion. It's just that it does make it harder for a lot of people who don't have experience with these devices to set it up. It takes a lot more effort than it used to get certain things to work. Though, on the other hand, the things that don't require a lot of effort, like setting up Dolphin and Aether SX2, it's still a really awesome handheld, and it allows you to play so many other games at amazing quality. The Snapdragon 8 Plus Gen 2 has been amazing. It is an incredibly powerful processor that allows for incredible levels of emulation, and it's still a relatively cheap device. Not saying $300 isn't a decent chunk of change, but for the level of performance you're getting and how much of a leap forward in terms of performance this was in comparison to the original Odin, it's massive. And you can still get the Odin 2 base model that was recently restocked now far more easily than you were in the past. I used to recommend the Odin 2 base, but it was a little bit hard to come by because it was frequently out of stock or perpetually out of stock. But nowadays, it's readily available and it's the most common variant. And the only benefits that the Pro and the Max model have is just has more RAM. They all have the same Snapdragon 8 Gen 2. It's just not really that big of a deal. Even when it comes to Nintendo Switch emulation, it doesn't really increase performance all that much, at least in any real way. It's not going to be the deciding factor between a game being playable and unplayable. Comparing the Odin to some of the other devices that I use kind of makes it obvious to me why I like the Odin 2 so much. I constantly have my Steam Deck with me, but even though I have it set up for emulators, it's not that fun of a way to play them. It's not as simple and clean as I would like it, even with things like EmuDeck. It's just not a seamless experience. And though also not perfectly seamless, the Odin 2 is a lot more comfortable, a lot easier to just quickly start up a game and play. Because I run Windows on my Steam Deck, it adds an extra layer of friction to, getting into games and, sort of the annoyance of having to boot Handheld Companion before I even do that because of having the controllers be detected at all. and sometimes performance in Windows can be a little bit stuttery, and the overall more seamless experience that the Odin 2 offers is, to me, infinitely more valuable than the potential of more performance that the Steam Deck offers. Because I've mentioned in some recent videos, I care about performance above anything else. I will sacrifice battery life, I will sacrifice ergonomics to some extent, if allows me to have higher and higher quality and frame rate options on my mobile gaming device. But for something like emulation, I don't think it will require anything that excessive or extreme. For me, when it comes to an emulation specific device, I care about having a nice balance, having a good value proposition. To me, I want to spend the least amount of money for the most amount of performance. And the Odin 2 strikes that balance really well. Because I made a video recently talking about Android emulation and how an Android phone is probably the most effective way to get budget emulation going, and how for most people it's probably all you realistically need, and I still stand by that. But for people who want to take it to the next level or prefer having a more uniform, all-in-one experience, the Odin 2 I feel like is still one of the best options all this time since it originally came out. And maximizing your budget, sure, like I said before, an Android phone is hands down probably the best option. What the best option for emulation is what you already have, because you don't necessarily need to buy something to start emulating games. Anyone who has an Android phone or now an iPhone can emulate consoles. But the moment you want to take it seriously and start purchasing a device, that's where I start to really have to think about how much you are willing to spend and what you want out of this kind of a device. And the Odin 2, I feel like, is still, like I mentioned before, a great option. This many months later, it's still a great value in comparison to a lot of the other handhelds out there. There's still some that have yet to be released, like the AYN Pocket Air S2 or some shit like that. And that has the weird Snapdragon GX2 something or other. It's impossible for me to remember all these fucking code names and names of these processors. They're always so long. So it still remains to be seen whether or not that could be a good competitor, but I don't really see a lot of good competition for this price point. At $300, the price point of the base model Odin 2, I just don't see a lot of many options out there for that price point. There's a lot around the $200 price point and some in between, but for really, I don't see any good options that realistically compete at a high level with the Odin 2 base model. It's just such a compelling device, and it's worth the investment, especially since I purchased it 6 months ago. Close to, but I'm fudging the numbers here for rounding purposes and sounds better in the title. You get what I mean. Even after all that time, the Odin 2 has been my primary device for emulation. It's just one of those devices that since I set it up, it's just been so easy to use. It's like I don't have to think about it. And anytime I start to think about having to make another video about one of these devices and I have to set it all up, and it's just a chore every time. And I do genuinely like a lot of those devices, but for me at least, this makes the most sense. It's really hard to compete with how easy it was for me to use. I love the ergonomics, the color is fantastic, the display is beautiful. Battery life is amazing too. There's so many amazing things about this device that you can see in my full review of this device. This is more like a 6 months later check-in. Though the landscape of emulation has changed so much since this device first launched, it's still one of my favorite handhelds and has stood the test of time remarkably well. It has replaced so many things that I've used. I used to have separate dedicated handheld that I like to play certain consoles on. For me, the only place I could play 3DS emulation, at least not necessarily emulation, but 3DS games was on an actual 3DS. It just felt the most natural there. But the convenience and performance that the Odin 2 provided was just fantastic. It has replaced multiple handhelds and combined them into one. I get that's the point of emulation. For me, I really liked having all these handhelds specialized for a certain set of systems, or using X device for just X console. It just, for me, felt like a lot more of a console-like experience. But for the Odin 2, it just encompassed everything so well. It was just, the overall experience was exemplary, that it has become my primary device when it comes to emulation. I used to emulate a lot of games on my desktop PC, but now I really don't do that because, getting moving saves is a nightmare. So I just keep it all on one device, the Odin 2, and it goes with me functionally everywhere whenever I leave the house. I've took it on trips. I use the docks to plug in fucking GameCube controllers and play some GameCube games on a fucking TV. It was amazing, and this device is fantastic for literally any emulation task I could possibly want out of it. It's still, to this day, my primary emulation device. But I would love to hear what you guys think about this device. Do you love your Odin 2? Do you want to get an Odin 2? Did this video make you want to get an Odin 2? I'll be down in the comments. I love seeing what you guys have to say. Don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe. All the other social media garbage down below. And last but not least, have a wonderful day.